Hey guys, welcome to another Friday video. So we're going back to 2008 and checking out this CPU. It is Intel's fastest Core 2 Duo, the E8600. So in this project we will take a closer look at the CPU, talk a little bit about the history. We have 3 video cards that are played around with, and yeah, we will see what this system can do with some classic retro PC games. So around 2008 it was a very interesting time, a time of transition. Windows XP moved to Windows Vista and dual core processors moved to quad core. In fact, in August of 2008 you had a choice. You could get the top dual core E8600 clocked at 3.33 gigahertz, or you could buy the Q9650, which also launched in August of 2008. This is a quad-core processor, but clocked lower at 3 gigahertz. And at the time, most games would still perform better on the higher clocked dual-core processor. But having 4 cores, obviously, more future-proof. And if you're trying to run modern games on these 2 CPUs, you will still have a fighting chance with the Q9650, whereas the E8600 is just not something you can use for modern games. So the E8600 has 2 cores running at 3.33 gigahertz. We have a frontside bus that runs at 333 megahertz, but with a quad data rate, so the effective FSB is 1333. We have a Wolfdale core built on a 45 nanometer process, 6 megabytes of level 2 cache. The chip got released in August of 2008 and for a price of $266. On the used market, I had a look at AliExpress and you can buy this CPU for around $14 including free shipping. For cooling, we're using the Intel boxed cooler with a copper core, and once again, no thermal paste, we're using a thermal pad. And this is the mainboard we're using today from ASUS. We have the P5G41TM-LX3 revision 1.01. So has a G41 chipset, which means there is onboard video, but we're using, of course, a dedicated graphics card. And this mainboard supports DDR3 memory. Fairly cheap, should cost you less than $30 on AliExpress. That's where I got mine from. If it has a BIOS, we're gonna flash it. Version 0503 from 2012 is the latest version. It mentions that it improves system stability. And after flashing the BIOS, I'll load the BIOS defaults. Then I disabled the onboard audio and Ethernet as well as the parallel port, but I left everything else on auto. We have a PCI Express 16X to 1X and a PCI slot. I really like the 1X slot up here because I like using dedicated sound cards for Windows XP projects so we can get some nice EAX audio. This is a fairly budget mainboard. We have 2 PS2, serial out, VGA out, 2 USB 2 ports, gigabit Ethernet and audio. And this is the RAM. We're using a 4 gigabyte DDR3 memory kit. I left everything at auto, and later I found out that the RAM is only running at 1066 megahertz. So at the final games that I benchmarked and tested, I went into the BIOS and set the speed to 1333. I don't think it will make too much of a difference, but yeah, just something worth mentioning. And I'm using a modern Windows 10 PC to partition and format this drive to make sure that the partitions are aligned. And I'm using a USB 3 hard drive adapter from Ugreen to do that. And once you install Windows XP, you get an option and you select the leave the current file system intact. And here we have the video cards that we're gonna work with today. So this is the GTX 960. This is my fastest Windows XP compatible graphics card that I have. And I wanted to make sure that the CPU is not being bottlenecked by the video card. Now, another option is this here. This is the GTX 750 Ti. This is the power efficiency champion. Doesn't require a PCI Express power connector and has terrific performance. We will see if it's even worth going with the 960 with the E8600. Maybe the processor is just not fast enough to take advantage of this GPU. And if you prefer using a ATI Radeon video card, we have here the HD7770, and the drivers are actually a little bit better, especially if you're using HDMI output, for example. You can configure the color range. And also if you want to use GPU scaling, that is fully supported with the Radeon drivers, whereas with NVIDIA on the newer driver versions, all these features have been disabled. For sound, I like using this particular sound card. It is the Creative Labs Sound Blaster X-Fi Titanium with the PCI Express interface. Very good for Windows XP retro gaming. In many games you can select the EAX audio option, and especially if you're interested in playing with headphones, you get some really cool 3D audio. Once again, I'm using the Easy to Boot project to install Windows XP off a USB flash drive. That worked perfectly fine, but I did run into an issue later on after installing the chipset drivers. The machine just wouldn't boot, and I installed Windows XP a second time, and I ran into the exact same issue. And the solution was really straightforward. It turned out, because I'm using a USB hard drive to install drivers and games, this machine will just not boot when the USB hard drive was connected. I did go into the BIOS and I changed all the BIOS options to make sure that it's only booting from the SSD, but still, whenever I had the USB hard drive plugged in, the machine wouldn't boot. So if you're running into that issue, that's how you solve it. So the Easy to Boot project took care of installing Windows XP, and then I have to install some drivers. And you've got two choices. You can go to the ASUS website, download the drivers from there, but I like using the Snappy Driver installer Origin project. It's basically, it detects all the devices and then installs all the drivers. I do untick sound and graphics drivers because I like to choose particular versions, but all the other components, it installed the drivers, and we were pretty much ready to go. So with the video drivers for NVIDIA, we've got version 368.81 from 2016. And from AMD, we're using the 14.4 drivers from 2014. With the Radeon drivers, the installer will fail. It will install the Catalyst Control Center, but the actual drivers will not install. All you have to do is reboot the machine after installing the drivers, and then through Device Manager, you manually look for the video card driver. You also need the .NET 2 framework in order for the Catalyst Control Center to work. For the sound card, we're using the Daniel K X-Fi Support Pack 4.0. I'm choosing the full driver installation. After a reboot, make sure you go into the settings and disable CMSS 3D. And finally, I'm just installing DirectX 9, and then I'm copying over games and benchmarks. So now let's have a closer look at the performance. I have some power consumption figures for you with the GTX 960 sitting idle on the desktop, 49 watts, playing a game, 131 watts, and then I swapped out the 750 Ti, which is more power efficient, only 105 watts for the entire system. Okay, let's have a look at 3D Mark first. This is with the GTX 960. In 2001 SE, we're getting 68,889. In 03, we're getting 82,258. And in 05, we're getting 22,949. Next up, I wanted to make sure that the video card is not holding back the system. Here we have Far Cry across a range of resolutions, and you can see between the lower resolutions and 1600 by 1200, there is no difference. The video card is powerful enough. We're being held back by the processor. We can see the same thing in Fear. We're getting 86 FPS minimum, 216 FPS average, and 483 FPS maximum at 1600 by 1200. Doom 3 also screams along really well, 215 FPS at all the resolutions, and that game has a 60 FPS cap anyway. Now the GTX 960 is very powerful, so what can you do? You can enable anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering. Preferably, if the game has options, do that in the game. Here we have Far Cry. I cranked up the anti-aliasing to 8x and anisotropic filtering to 16x, and at 1600 by 1200 we're still getting 170 FPS. So the video card is so powerful, you can max out all these quality eye candy features and you will still get terrific performance. Now, what about the GTX 750 Ti? In Far Cry 1600 by 1200, 8x anti-aliasing and 16x anisotropic filtering, 173 FPS, so the same performance as the GTX 960. In Fear, with 1600 by 1200, with soft shadows, we're getting a minimum of 82, an average of 160, and a maximum of 314. So the minimum score is basically identical to the GTX 960, with the average and the maximum just a little bit lower, but you will guaranteed get at least 60 FPS in this game. In Doom 3 1600 by 1200 we're getting 219 FPS, which is a little bit faster than the GTX 960. Could just be a difference in architecture. Either way, the 750 Ti is a really good match for the E8600, and it does so while consuming less power. And here we have the Radeon 7770. This one requires a 6-pin PCI Express power connector, so not quite as energy efficient as the 750 Ti. Performance is also a little bit lower. In Far Cry we're getting 140 FPS, which is still very good. In Fear, unfortunately, the minimum FPS does drop down to 50 with the average of 102 and the maximum of 221. And in Doom 3 we're getting 181 FPS. So still a very decent card, not quite as fast as the Nvidia cards, but the driver's a little bit better. You can configure the HDMI color space, and you can also use GPU scaling, which are features that do not work on the Nvidia cards. And now let's have a look at some games. Here we have Far Cry running at 1600 by 1200 with 8x AA and 16x AF. Beautifully looking game. I recommend getting the GOG version without DRM. And yeah, that's a game I love playing every time I have a retro gaming PC in my hands. Fear is next. Now this game has really interesting graphics options. We're using soft shadows and no anti-aliasing, but 16x AF at 1600 by 1200. Fantastic looking game, and also has a really good sound stage with an EAX sound card and headphones. So definitely pick it up. There is a little patch you need to install to do with the USB input. There's a bug which can affect performance. Do download that from the PC Gaming Wiki. But yeah, also another game I picked up from GOG. Yeah, if you haven't played that one yet, definitely do so. It's one of the highlights of PC gaming history. Here we have Halo running at 1600 by 1200. I'm just running around in this map. It's a LAN session, but I'm the only player. But yeah, I also played a little bit of the campaign, and you will get fantastic performance in this game. Doom 3 1600 by 1200 with ultra details. Ultra details means uncompressed textures. You need at least 512 megabytes of VRAM, and I also chose 8x AA, and I believe the ultra setting will use 8x AF as well. So this game has an engine lock of 60 FPS, so to get rid of tearing and any other issues, you might want to consider playing this with VSync enabled. Need for Speed Underground. Out of the box, the highest resolution is 1280 by 1024. There are some mods you can use to get 1600 by 1200, but I didn't have enough time to sort all that out. Maximum details. I went into the options, enabled light trails and motion blur, and what a beautifully looking game. The engine is capped at 60 FPS, however. Need for Speed Underground 2. This game has an engine cap of 120 FPS. We're running at 1600 by 1200. I set the highest setting for anti-aliasing and 16x anisotropic filtering in the driver. But to my surprise, on this machine, this game does not hold 120 FPS. And definitely nothing to do with the video card, because I tried the Radeon and the 750 Ti. The performance doesn't change, so it might just be the processor. I also tried running the game on a single core. You can use Task Manager and set the CPU affinity, but the performance issues remained. This game just doesn't keep locked at 120 FPS. Half-Life 2, this is a classic, always have to test this game. This is the latest version from Steam, which is actually DRM free. You can just copy it across with a USB thumb drive. 4x anti-aliasing and 16x anisotropic filtering. In-game settings of maxed out all the other options as well, and silky smooth performance. Colin McRae Rally 2, 1600 by 1200. This is a version from GOG, but they pulled it from the store. I was lucky enough to get it back in the day when it was still available. 8x anti-aliasing in the option, in the game options, and 16x anisotropic filtering, and we're getting decent performance. Here we have Splinter Cell Chaos Theory. This is my favorite Splinter Cell game of all times. All details are maxed out. We've got shader 3.0. We're running at 1600 by 1200 with 16x anisotropic filtering. No anti-aliasing in this game, and yep, performance is silky smooth. The next two games are recent pickups from GOG. We've got Gunship from 2000. Couldn't do anything. Couldn't figure out how to get off the ground, which is a common issue when I try to play any simulator games. And the other game is a shooter called Red Mercury from 2004. Didn't really enjoy this game. The controls were just not tight, and I don't know. Doesn't seem to be a game that would be a lot of fun to play, at least not for me. And then I bought two games from Zoom. They launched a store for retro games, so we will see how that develops. We have Midnight GT Primary Racer running at 1600 by 1200, and yeah, it's an interesting looking game. The graphics are definitely very colorful and flashy, but the controls, it didn't feel that good. And the other game I checked out was Gunmetal, running at 1600 by 1200 with 8x anti-aliasing. This game looked a lot more promising. I didn't really get deep into the game, but I enjoyed the few minutes of gameplay. And finally, the most important game on the planet, does it run Crysis? And yes, it does. It does a fairly decent job at running this game. So this is with the GTX 960, and I know there are a lot of videos out there with quad-core, Core 2 quad processors running Crysis. I still believe that a faster clocked dual-core CPU is the way to go in this game, and also Windows XP. You can't select the very high details, so it will max out with the high details, but even so, the performance should be better under Windows XP compared to Vista. At least that's what the benchmarks showed back in the day. And while there are scenes where the game will drop below 60 FPS, for the most part, if you had an E8600 and a decent video card back in the day, you could enjoy Crysis quite, to a fairly high standard. So guys, that was taking a look at the E8600, the fastest Intel Core 2 Duo. Now, just for completeness sake, there is a Xeon version. Basically, there's a Xeon Core 2 CPU out there that's clocked even higher. Might be something for another video, but in terms of a Core 2 Duo, the E8600 is the highest clocked version, and for Windows XP retro gaming, the performance is fantastic. Talking about the video card, the GTX 960, it is the fastest XP video card I have, but I just like the 750 Ti a lot better. Doesn't need a power connector, and the performance was just as good. It has enough grunt and horsepower to play around with anti-aliasing and anisotropic filtering. However, if you have an HDMI monitor or you want to use GPU scaling, then you're better off with an ATI Radeon card. And that's nothing to do with the video card, it's all about the drivers. At some stage, NVIDIA just totally neglected the Windows XP drivers, and you just get a very bare bone experience, which is a bit of a shame. But it is what it is, and definitely worth mentioning, just so you don't avoid any issues. The issue with the HDMI color space, what does that mean? It means if you're using an NVIDIA card and you're connecting an HDMI monitor, the colors might be washed out. The blacks will be a little bit gray, and the whites will also be a little bit gray. And usually under Windows 10, you can go in there and change the color space from limited to full RGB. Under Windows XP and an NVIDIA card, you are locked to limited RGB, which is very annoying. With storage, I usually always get a few comments about using an SSD with Windows XP. Yes, it doesn't support the trim command, but modern drives have garbage collection built in, and just leave like half or a third of the capacity free, so it can do its thing with garbage collection. You should be fine. I'm still using very old SSDs with Windows XP and haven't had an issue. Having said that, I don't like use a Windows XP for long-term use. It's really just playing a few games. So in that scenario, I think you should be just fine. With the RAM, you can get mainboards with DDR2 and DDR3 and shouldn't make a difference. Performance will be very similar with these Core 2 CPUs. Have 2 gigs or 4 gigs of RAM in dual channel configuration. That's pretty much all you need to look out for. And like I got called out in this video, do check that the memory speed is at the highest setting. If not, change the auto memory speed and manually lock it in. For sound, you definitely want to have a sound blaster with Windows XP Retro games. EAX had hardware acceleration. That just doesn't exist anymore. And if you like listening to clear and clean audio and you want to use headphones and get some 3D audio going, you will love X-Fi cards with Windows XP or Retro games. And yeah, so I think I covered everything. These are parts you can pick up for fairly cheap prices on the used market, depending, of course, where you live. I will put some links down in the description for AliExpress. For you guys out there that live maybe a little bit more remote, or you don't have access to a healthy used PC parts market like myself. And now, please let me know, what do you think about this project? Back in the day, 2008, what system were you using? Did you put your money on a faster dual-core processor, or were you looking into the future and you bought a quad-core? Maybe the famous E8600 with a bit of overclocking. That was a popular choice back in the day. So yeah, and also, how was the transition, the move from XP to Vista for you? I know for a long time I was dual booting XP and Vista. Some games took advantage of DirectX 10, but other games just ran better under Windows XP. So yeah, guys, let me know what you think. I read every comment. Give it a thumbs up, share the video with your friends, sub to the channel if you haven't done so already. Let me know what sort of projects you want to see going forward. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching. I shall see you soon with another one.